Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and in this video we're talking about the best and worst books I read by month in 2020. Firstly, let's just get this out of the way. I know this video is hella late. I meant to record it ages ago and have it up in January and was feeling some burnout. That didn't end up happening. We're doing it now. I actually asked over on Twitter, I put up a poll for a whole 7 minutes being like, hey, do you guys still want this or is it too late? And I think the most people that have ever participated in one of my polls voted unanimously, yes, still do the video. So if you were one of those people, honestly, thank you so much, because I was having a little bit of a panic as to whether or not anyone would actually still care. If you've seen one of my best and worst videos of the year before, you know that I do them a little bit differently, and every time I compile my lists, I feel a little bit weird about it. And this is simply because I'm not going to my sheets and going, okay, what were all the 5-star reads, and looking for the best 10 or 12 or 20 or whatever 5-star reads, and then all of the books that I rated the lowest. Instead, I go back to my monthly wrap-ups and I look at what was the worst book I read that month and what was the best book I read that month. And because that's how I do it, there are some books that are the worst books I read this year that aren't really the worst books I read this year, they just happen to be the worst book I read that month. I try to cater my reading to things that I know I'm going to enjoy, and a 3-star rating is not necessarily bad, so I just wanted to throw that out there because there are some books on here that are definitely not the worst books I read this year, but just because of when I read them in the year, they appear on this list. You might be asking yourself, why don't you go look at your list and figure out what the best books and the worst books of the year actually were for you? And that's because I read over 200 books a year, and scrolling through a spreadsheet of that many books is way too daunting. This kind of wrap-up is more about looking over the year and remembering these books that I really loved or that I was kind of about. That means we will start with January. In January, the book that I gave the lowest rating was The Devil's Dictionary. You might think to yourself, why would you want to read a dictionary? That sounds terrible, and you're not wrong. This was a bunch of dictionary entries compiled from a newspaper where somebody would take a topic or a word and give it like a satirical definition. And I could see that being interesting, seeing 5 of them or so in a newspaper at a time, but yeah, reading an entire dictionary wasn't fun. If I'm remembering correctly, because this was so old, there were a bunch of social concepts or references that I just didn't understand, and therefore wasn't as interesting as it could have been to me. The best thing I read in January was Heart and Soul by Erin Kinsella, who is also a booktuber. I will link her channel down below. This book is about Tessa, who is a Canadian novelist, and she wrote a historical piece that is actually being turned into a TV show in Korea. So she's traveling to Korea to kind of see the behind the scenes of the TV show being created. When she gets there, she finds out that her bias from her favorite K-pop group is actually playing the lead. From there, some shenanigans ensue and a fake to real relationship happens, and it's wonderful. Also, this series is hella queer. This is the first in the series and it is the only one published. However, she is writing a book for every single member of 24/7, so that's at least 7 books, and then I have some insider knowledge as to maybe another book to do with another side character, and I cannot wait. In February, the book I gave the lowest rating was House of Whispers. This was a graphic novel volume that falls somewhere in the Sandman universe, and really the reason why this was the thing that resonated with me the least is because I have not caught up on Sandman. I read a bunch of the comics many, many years ago, but because I don't have all of that backing knowledge going into this book, it just wasn't my favorite thing. It was still a 3-star, it was still an interesting premise, I really enjoyed the art, all of those things, but it just wasn't my favorite that month. However, something I absolutely loved was Hey Kiddo. This, firstly, is a graphic novel, but they also have a full cast audiobook. And some of the people that are characters in the graphic novel are actually playing themselves in the audiobook. And in the case of when the characters are younger, those people's children are actually playing their younger selves in the audiobook. It was a whole production. It was just really good. In March, my least favorite book was another audiobook, and that was The Magic Finger. This is a Roald Dahl book. It's one of the ones I just didn't get around to reading when I was a kid, or if I did, I completely forgot about it because this just isn't one of the good ones. I do believe, however, this was the one that was narrated by Kate Winslet, so there was that. But essentially the main character has a magic finger, and some shenanigans ensue. It's not very long, it wasn't terribly great. Let's move on. My favorite book I read in March was An Arc of the Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home. Now, I got this from the library back when I could, work at the library, because back before the current state of the world. March, if you'll remember, is when things actually shut down. And I got this book because sometimes I would work in the cataloging department and I saw it just sitting on the desk of the person who gets all of the arcs. And I flailed about it because I love Welcome to Night Vale. She, however, had no idea what it was, and she was just like, if you want this, it's like the third in a series nobody else has read, so like, here, have it. And I was just so excited to get it because this is the backstory of the faceless old woman who secretly lives near home, which is one of the characters in Welcome to Night Vale. Who also, if you listen to the podcast, the narrator is Mara Wilson, who you might know from Matilda, so that's a whole callback to not really liking the magic finger, because, you know, Roald Dahl. Although this is the third Welcome to Night Vale novel, you don't have to have read the first two to enjoy this. I would suggest some familiarity with the podcast itself, but I'm definitely not caught up on that podcast. As soon as I realized that I could be listening to books from the library, I stopped listening to podcasts. So there's probably like 3 to 4 years of Night Vale I need to catch up on. Just know going into this that it is a super weird world, and this one gets dark and creepy, which is some of the things I love about Night Vale. I'm a fan. In April, the thing that I liked the least was The Personality Brokers. This was a book about the women that created the Myers-Briggs test. Thinking back on this, some of the enjoyment factor was probably diminished for me just because of how flawed the testing actually was, as opposed to thinking that this book wasn't written well. It was very, very well researched. I really enjoyed that aspect of it, but personality tests like this and the very flawed way that people put them together was probably part of the reason why this wasn't a success for me. That being said, if I remember correctly, I gave this 3 stars, so it wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. My favorite book I read in April was Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. This is a hate-to-love romance between these two guys. One of them works for this charity, and because his parents were famous rock stars, occasionally the paparazzi just follows him around for no reason, even though he has nothing to do with the music business. And they have photographed him doing things that any human could do. Do you trip in the street? I know that I do, but if he does it, suddenly it's front page, and the people that give money to his charity don't want to give money to his charity because he's not one of the good gays, which is just a whole thing that is discussed in this book. To keep his job, he has to up his image by getting a nice boyfriend. He's introduced to this very fine lawyer, and it goes from there. May is the month that I least want to discuss because I did honestly really enjoy the book that ended up being my least favorite of this month. There was just everything else was better. And the book that I liked the least this month happened to be Ghost Squad. I really liked Ghost Squad. I don't want to put it on the worst of the year list. Ghost Squad is a debut middle grade adventure book about this girl who can see ghosts, and her whole family is kind of centered around this tree that's in their yard, but they might be losing their house, and if they lose their house, are they going to lose their family, and all of those types of things. She has a great best friend, there's an adventurous grandmother character. It was really sweet and lovely, and I honestly just feel bad that I read a bunch of really good books in May that happen to be better than this one because it doesn't deserve to be on a worst list. To make this section even more contentious, the best thing I read in May wasn't even a book, it was a webcomic, and that was Lore Olympus. I am so glad that I didn't actually start reading this years ago when my friend Paige told me to, because I got to speed all the way through it, over 100 volumes, and this is an incredibly slow burn romance between Persephone and Hades, and I actually finally got to a point within the 2 days of reading this where something big happened, and yeah, that sweet, sweet pain of the slow burn, like, I love it, but also I really liked that I could catch up and not have to spend years getting to it myself. This is an incredibly beautiful webcomic. I cannot stress enough how gorgeous the art is. I actually have art for it as the wallpaper on my phone, and I have ever since May, and I don't think I'm gonna take it away because it's gorgeous. On to June, and the book that I actually hated the most out of the entire year, which was called Stonewall Riots. Now you would think to yourself, with a book called Stonewall Riots, that you would learn something about the Stonewall Riots. In the case of this short graphic novel, you would be incorrect. This was a mostly white, mostly gay history of queerness in the United States that, you know, mentioned Stonewall once, but didn't actually tell you what happened there. To get to the depths of how bad this was, it didn't even mention Marsha P. Johnson, so that's how bad this was. It was the worst thing that I read all year. The best book of June, though, was Felix Ever After. This was actually a big surprise to me because I've read a couple of Kacen Callender's other books previously, and they weren't favorites for me. This, however, was fantastic. Felix is a black gay trans artist going to an art program, and somebody decides to display pictures of him from before his transition, and he thinks he knows who it is, so he goes on a catfishing scheme to try to catch out the person. I love a good revenge plot, I love a good romance, I love people understanding who they are and queer people coming together in community, and this just had all of that in there. In July, the book I liked the least was the graphic novel How to Talk to Girls at Parties. This just wasn't overall great. If I'm remembering correctly, it didn't really explain the kind of fantasy, science-y elements very well whatsoever. I also remember having a feeling at the end that a character could have been being transphobic. It just wasn't my favorite. However, somebody who is very good at explaining science-y things is the author Hank Green of A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor, which is the concluding sequel to An Absolutely Remarkable Thing. Being the second book in a duology, I can't really go into what really happens in this book because major spoilers. Just know that I was listening to the audiobook from the library. I managed to get the first hold on the audiobook, so I was listening to it basically when it was published. And as I was listening to the audiobook, I went into a bookstore for the first time in months just to grab the book off the shelf, pay for it, and bring it home with me because I knew without even finishing the book that I was going to want to have a copy. In August, the book I liked the least was a poetry collection called Space Struck. This is not a big surprise to me because I'm not a big poetry person. So even if poetry is 3-star and it's fine, it's usually going to end up at the bottom of my list. The book that I liked the most in August was Hideous Beauty by William Hussey. This book is incredibly sad and I loved it. I didn't know anything about this book going into it. I connected with the author on Instagram, probably to do with something that I was commenting on from George Lester, because I'm pretty sure that's how I connect to William Hussey. And he was just like, hey, would you like me to send you a signed copy of my book? And I went, yes, I would love a signed copy of your book. George says that your writing is lovely. I would like to read it. He sent it. I didn't take a look at what it was. I just knew it was going to be queer, and it is really good. Because going into it, Synopsis Unseen was my experience with the book. That's kind of how I want to tell other people to do it. If that doesn't work for you, you can look up the synopsis. It is very sad, but it's also a murder mystery, and there's a bunch of different elements to it, and I just really enjoyed it. He has another book coming out this year. I just got an ARC for it. I'm hoping to read it really, really soon. In September, the book that I liked the least was a graphic novel called Skim. This was about growing up in Toronto in the 90s, and it had a kind of hinting at an inappropriate relationship between the teenage protagonist and one of her female teachers. And I think that the reason that I liked this the least that month is how that was inappropriate never really came up. You never really actually got to see anything on the page as to whether or not what you expect happened. But at the same time, like, at no point was she given any support, or did she tell anybody about this circumstance. And it just felt like there should have been some way of pointing out that people should not be having these types of relationships, because you see it all the time in media where impressionable teenagers are attracted to their young teachers, and how that just should not be a boundary that you cross. My favorite book that I read in September was Pulp by Robin Talley. This one had dual timelines, one in the 50s and one in the current day. And it had to do with these two different characters learning about lesbian pulp novels and how that affected them in their own timelines. I loved the parallels between these stories because the woman in the earlier timeline only really came into her queerness after reading some lesbian pulp, whereas our main character in the current timeline already knew she was queer and was looking back at these novels and wondering why they always end badly and all of these things. And she had to learn all this queer history about lesbian pulp and how they couldn't be published if they had a happy ending. So I really enjoy that this taught the reader a lot of queer history. And then of course it's a bibliophilic book, so I'm predisposed to enjoy it. In October, the book that I liked the least was Blood and Vinyl. This is a book that covered a lot of prompts for whichever readathon I was doing at the time. There were a bunch of spooky readathons. It covered a bunch of prompts for a bunch of different spooky readathons. However, this book, how it was written and what happened in it, it wasn't descriptive enough for me to really care about a lot of the characters. What happened over the course of this book could have easily happened over the course of 3 books, but it was also incredibly short. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense if you haven't haven't read it yourself, but that's just how I felt about it. My favorite book that I read in October ended up also being my favorite book of the year, which is funny because I read it twice before I read it in October, but just the way that things worked out, it didn't make it to the top of my list until this month, and that is Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. I was lucky enough to receive a physical ARC of this book before everything started shutting down, mostly because I met Aiden back in November of 2019 at Geek Girl Con, and I went, who do I harass for an ARC when the time comes, and was able to get that information. Really, obviously, super enjoyed this book. If this is the first time you've heard of this book, hello, it's amazing. Yadriel is a trans boy who hasn't been able to go through his ritual to become a Brujo because his family is kind of iffy on whether or not that's how the magic is going to work, because they still see him as what he is not. And he decides he's going to prove himself. He ends up conjuring the spirit of a newly dead boy, and that boy just won't leave. And if he won't leave, he can't prove to his family that he is a Brujo, so they have to go on an adventure together. If you've been putting off reading this book, just do it. Also, if audiobooks are your things, the narrator of the book is also trans, which was just fantastic. I love that we're at a point in publishing where the trans representation can go into every aspect of this book. My least favorite book that I read in November was Weekend by Christopher Pike. If I'm remembering correctly, this is the one where they are stranded in a location, but this isn't the snowy one because that was Slumber Party. This is the one where they're in a house in the middle of the desert in Mexico. Yes, correct. Because I read these Christopher Pike books basically back to back, they seem to have the exact same plot, which is just unfortunate. But I felt like this one did it worse, which is why it ended up at the bottom of the barrel. My favorite book of this month was a complete surprise to me because I was reading it as a joke, and that's Trans Wizard Harriet Porber and the Bad Boy Parasaurolophus. Pretty sure I pronounce that word different every single time I say it, but I go for it, so give me the credit for that. As you might be able to guess from the title and the cover, this is a parody on a certain franchise that I am no longer supporting. But outside of that parody aspect, this was sweet and funny and a wonderful romance and a wonderful queer trans romance who had 2 trans leads. And honestly, I loved this book so much. I actually did an entire reading vlog for this book where I told you after every chapter what had gone down and what my feelings were, so I'll be sure to link that below. Finally, in December, the book that I liked the least was The Yiddish Policeman's Union. This was a mystery. It took place in Alaska, in a place that doesn't actually exist, which was context I didn't have until after I read the book. So because I don't tend to read a full synopsis before I go into a book, that's partially my bad, I guess. I'm also predisposed not to heavily enjoy this because a lot of it has to do with religion and slightly different warring factions of the same religion, and I can never figure out why these people can't just get along. And I know that's flippant and probably comes off as kind of crass, but that's just not something that I can wrap my head around generally. This was just one of those books that I ended up not being super excited to pick it up every time I was reading it, which is not what you want when you're reading a book. My favorite book that I read in December is a book that is not yet out, is on the top of a lot of anticipated lists, and that's One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. I think we all know that Red, White, and Royal Blue was my favorite book of 2019, so obviously I was heavily anticipating this one. There was a little bit of a thing to do with the way it is described and what it actually is and how that's a little bit juxtaposed. Going into this, because of the way it's blurbed, I thought that it was a Kate Leopold retelling, which is a movie that I hadn't actually seen before, so I watched the movie before reading the book. The things that those 2 stories have in common are time travel and New York, and that's basically it. However, that obviously did not affect my enjoyment of this book because it was fantastic. It was beautifully written, it had some great inclusive characters, all the side characters were just wonderful. I really loved the element of trying to figure out why what was happening. I'm really trying to talk about it without any spoilers because obviously it's not even out yet, so that is just not fair. It is as good as you are expecting it to be. You are going to love it when you get to it. What was your best and worst of 2020? Let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you are here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you're on your keyboard. Some people have asked if there's a way to financially support this channel, so I set up a Ko-fi account, which is a digital tipping service. The link for that is down below, as well as the link to my PayPal and my Amazon wishlist in case you would like to buy me a book. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!